Do you remember what it was like to be in middle school? Do you remember when you weren't sure if you were funny enough, if you were cool enough, if you had good enough grades? Remember all the changes that your body went through? Remember all the changes that your hormones went through? Can you imagine being in a scenario where you were dealing with all that and got to a state where you were questioning your existence? And when you went to talk to your mother about that, their response was to ignore it and to put you on camera. We're going to talk about it today. Today's episode is all about part two of The House of My Mother by Shari Franke. If you've been following along with us, then you know that this young lady has been through so much. For those of you who haven't been following along with us, a quick rehash is that we're talking about the daughter of Ruby Franke. If you haven't seen or aren't familiar with the whole debacle with Ruby Franke, Jodi Hildebrandt, then I suggest you watch the past couple episodes and reacquaint yourself and come on back because we don't want you to miss a thing. Today's episode deals with mental health, and I want to make sure that I give you guys an opportunity to pass on if you are very sensitive about unaliving ideation, because we're going to get into that. And I really want you all to protect your mental health. As always, if you see me put my head down or look off to the side, I have notes, honey. I can't remember all this stuff. So we're going to get into part two, as I said, which is chapter 8 through 15. So in chapter 8, Shari begins to once again talk about how her mother approached motherhood. Shari says Ruby approached motherhood with, quote, the intensity of an Olympic athlete training for gold, her identity singularly focused on procreation for more than a decade. So by now in our story, Ruby's sisters and even a brother already had YouTube channels. It just seemed logical that Ruby would follow suit and excel. In this part of the book, Shari touches on how important it is in the LDS faith to bear witness and be a testimony. And so Ruby really took this approach in terms of YouTube. However, Shari was very quick to point out that Ruby didn't always do all this with the utmost authenticity. Shari describes their YouTube channel as a cautionary tale of when the line between authenticity and performance becomes blurred beyond recognition. In chapter 9, Shari says that Ruby was really getting into the swing of YouTube and like making it part of their lifestyle as a family. In Shari's description, their lives now revolved around nonstop content creation, whether we liked it or not. She goes on to say, all I wanted was to grow up in peace, deal with my bodily changes and those pesky new zits without it being recorded. But that just was not in the cards for Shari, especially with Ruby Franke as a mother. According to Shari, Ruby approached YouTube with the dedication of a startup CEO, putting in long hours day after day. Shari then goes into detail about how Ruby changed their whole lives just so she could fulfill this newfound mission on YouTube. Ruby became hyper focused on getting those first 1,000 subscribers. By year's end, an unfathomable 50 million strangers had glimpsed into our lives. So you can kind of see how this would be super uncomfortable for somebody in their preteen years, and it wasn't going to get any better for Shari. In chapter 10, Shari talks about how Ruby remodeled their home to make it more visually appealing to a YouTube audience. Shari felt like it was one of those recurring nightmares where you're suddenly naked on a stage with a sea of eyes staring back at you, mocking. Like any other preteen or teenager, Shari did figure out a way to use this to her advantage. Shari learned to ask for privileges while the camera was rolling, and Ruby fell into it by offering for her children to use the 8 passengers credit card in exchange for filming various life events. Now, obviously, with more followers and subscribers, Ruby started to see changes financially, and Shari notices this. She says that their family went from one that had to make do to one that had too much and more on the way. As I mentioned before, Shari does a fantastic job of being graceful when it comes to her mother. She doesn't always describe Ruby as a terrible person. She goes into a little bit of behind the scenes in terms of Ruby's video that she filmed documenting her miscarriage. In recalling this story, Shari says that she was glad that Ruby was able to be raw and vulnerable. Still, she acknowledges how exploitative family vlogging can be in terms of children. She says, my unborn baby brother in heaven would suffer no ill effects from Ruby sharing his story. But what about the rest of us, whose stories are being shared daily? And what does consent really look like when you're a child, too afraid to say no? As chapter 11 begins, we see that Shari decides to start her own YouTube channel. Now, I can't say for sure that this is Shari's official channel, but I did find a channel that has Shari's videos. So I'm going to link it below. And if you guys are like familiar with her YouTube channel from back in the day, let me know if this is real or not. It has videos from like 5 years ago, so it could be legit, but that is pure speculation. See what I did there? Back to the story. And since Shari wasn't old enough to have an AdSense account, Ruby managed that for her, of course. Now, even though Ruby had a massive following on her 8 Passengers account, she was not in any way willing to help Shari. According to Shari, Ruby said, no shortcuts, no shout outs. You need to get to 100,000 subscribers on your own, just like I did, and then I'll give you a shout out on 8 Passengers. Time out. All this talk about subscribers, and have you subscribed? I mean, you've made it all the way to this episode. Clearly, you must enjoy this at least a little bit, a little tiny bit. So if you do enjoy it just a little tiny bit or a lot of bit, go ahead and hit that thumbs up, or you could, subscribe so you can keep going. And as always, I welcome you to comment. Okay. I'll get you back to the story. Thanks, guys. In addition to managing Shari's AdSense account, Ruby also had to approve every single post that Shari made across her social media platforms. Now, even though it's pretty typical for a parent to want to oversee what their children are doing online, Shari wasn't really sure if Ruby was doing this out of concern for Shari or if it was out of concern for maintaining their wholesome image. The line between genuine parental concern and brand management was often blurry in our household. Looking back on it, Shari kind of felt like recording and editing and posting was a chore and torturous for her, and she expresses guilt in exploiting her siblings. Worst of all, she felt like she was behaving just like Ruby. To top it off, Shari felt like the comments Ruby was getting on 8 Passengers was feeding into her religious narcissism. On the flip side of that, Shari saw that the attention that she was getting from her own YouTube channel started to garner her favor with the popular crowd at school and even some attention from a boy she had a crush on named Jake. In fact, it was with that boy Jake that Shari shared her first kiss. And it was that boy named Jake who prompted Shari to download Snapchat, which she was not supposed to do and was forbidden from doing by Ruby. According to the book, Ruby was furious when she found out that Shari had gone behind her back and downloaded the app. Ruby snapped at Shari and said that these actions put the entire family at risk, saying, we're public figures. Every move we make, every word we say directly impacts our income. So, income. So, in all of the chastising that Ruby did in terms of Shari's disobedience in downloading the app, none of it was from a standpoint of concern for Shari's safety. Chapter 12 opens in a heartbreaking way where you find Shari journaling, I don't think my mother loves me. Shari was having a really hard time being in the public eye and reading comments that people left about her, going as far as calling her a kiss ass. Shari wished they could understand her viewpoint, saying, I'm not sucking up. I'm surviving, I thought. There's a difference. It was around this point that Shari realized that she was actually battling depression, and she reached out to her father, Kevin, who actually agreed that she should have therapy. Unfortunately for Shari, Ruby did not agree. Mom says all problems can be solved with prayer, diet, and exercise. Chapter 13 opens up pretty much with Ruby on the same shenanigans that she's been on, exploiting Shari. So she offers to wax Shari's brows, and it turns out disastrous. But of course, Ruby records it and posts it up on 8 Passengers. This whole ordeal was just another example of Shari feeling like she had zero autonomy in terms of her own life and even her own body. Around this same time, Ruby made Shari switch junior high schools, saying, "You'll like your new school better," Ruby declared. "The classes are much smaller, the teachers are excellent, and everyone there will be of our faith." So as all these changes start to like pile down on Shari, she actually ends up having a panic attack in the bathroom. And this is where she describes having that unaliving ideation. She finds herself thinking, there must be something deeply, fundamentally wrong with me for God's plan to hurt this much. Hey there. As I was editing, I discovered that all of chapter 14's review and a very critical piece was missing from the video, so I am recording it now, and that might explain why the lighting is a little different. We just got finished talking about Shari and her unaliving ideation. And I just wanted to make sure that all of you know that there is help out there. So if you're experiencing the same kind of mental distress, I'm going to drop a link in the description for 988 Lifeline. Please check it out. Please know that you are not alone and that you are loved. Now we'll move on to chapter 14. As we talked about in the previous chapters, Ruby has switched Shari to another school. In fact, it's actually the same school that her younger brother Chad went to. So she gets to see him in the hallways, goofing off with his friends, and she has some feelings about that. Shari says, "I always found myself torn between embarrassment and a grudging admiration for Chad's ability to be so carefree." Even though Chad's like a bit of a loose cannon, Sherry really admires how he just kind of does whatever he wants, and whatever he wants to say, he speaks up about it. Now, last chapter, we talked about Sherry experiencing something pretty heavy. And after that, she actually went to talk to her father, Kevin, and he agreed that she should be able to have therapy and set it up. It took Sherry several therapy sessions to get to the point where she felt confident and comfortable enough to talk to her therapist about things that dealt specifically with Ruby. One of those things was piano lessons. She finally admitted that she didn't want to take piano lessons, and her therapist actually brought Ruby in so that Sherry could express that feeling to her, but in a safe space. So Sherry let her know, and Ruby was like, "Okay, fine. You don't have to take lessons." And it seemed like everything was going to be okay, but there was something in the back of Sherry's mind that knew that Ruby wasn't just going to let this drop. So a few weeks later, Sherry comes in from school. She's trying to wolf down her dinner because she's really looking forward to talking with her therapist. She feels like things are going great and she's making progress. And Ruby lays this on her. "I had a chat with Dr. Winters today. She thinks you're just fine. She doesn't want to waste our money on unnecessary sessions." When Sherry heard this, she was actually devastated. She could not for the life of her figure out why her therapist would say something like that, especially since she had confided in her that she was having those unaliving ideations. And she expressed this to Ruby. Ruby basically told her that the therapist said that Sherry had an active imagination, and Ruby says, "Mommy's little drama queen is looking for attention." Obviously, that wasn't Sherry's issue at all. Sherry was crushed. She felt like all of her autonomy was being squashed. She felt like her personality was being squashed. She felt like her needs were not being met at all by her mother. And she really just felt like she had no voice, no say, no existence in her family. Sherry wraps it up like this: "In this family, the only safe emotion was no emotion at all." Coming into chapter 15, things start to look up for Sherry a bit. Sherry's figuring out a way to kind of take control of her life in her own little forms here and there. She talks about a situation where her and her family went to go skiing, but she decided she was going to snowboard instead. Shari says, "Yes, I spent more time horizontal than vertical, but I didn't care. This is something I had chosen for myself, different from what the rest of my family was doing." So, even in that small way, that decision and her ability to be able to choose snowboarding rather than skiing like everyone else gave her some sense of power for herself. Also, her YouTube channel was blossoming and she finally was getting some traction as far as subscribers, to the point where on her 15th birthday, Ruby woke her up with the gift of a brand new tripod for her channel. Now, of course, this is abnormal for Ruby, so you know there has to be some sort of gimmick. And there was. Ruby had cameras rolling, of course. She was announcing to her 8 passengers viewers that, ta-da, Shari actually already has a channel, because by then Shari had met the requisite number of subscribers so that she could be blessed with a shout out from Ruby. So, on one hand, Shari felt really good about getting that recognition from her mother, but she still felt conflicted, saying, "It felt like a milestone of my own getting that validation from my mom, even though it cemented my public persona as Ruby's mini me rather than my own person." Now, to add insult to injury, Ruby laid it on to Shari that she would be charging her a management fee. Now, this is about the part where the lost footage was over. So we'll go back to the footage from earlier. So you might see the lighting change. Sorry about that, guys. In typical Ruby fashion, Ruby charged Shari a 10% management fee, telling Shari, "You really think you would have ever started a YouTube channel, let alone a successful one, without my help? You owe me, Shari. Business is business." Say it with me. The audacity. She didn't even do anything to help Shari get to the requisite number of subscribers. She treated her as if she would have treated anyone else, and then, of course, charged her. You guys, Shari was going through it. Every time it looked like she had a victory, then somehow Ruby would come around and take the wind out of her sails. Unfortunately, Shari was not the only one suffering under Ruby's rule. Shari talks about noticing how Chad was struggling too. "While I tended to keep everything bottled up inside, Chad was more like a shaken up bottle of Mentos and Coke, incapable of restraint. He was like a force of nature, constantly pushing boundaries and testing limits." So Shari talks about, how Chad loved to pull pranks and how he just never really knew where the line was. He was always pushing the boundaries, always doing something, and eventually got expelled from school. According to Shari, in Ruby and Kevin's eyes, Chad was becoming some kind of juvenile delinquent, a malfunctioning robot. As opposed to the way they treated Shari when she actually wanted to go and get mental health help, they ran all over the place looking for different therapists to work with Chad and fix him. Unfortunately for Ruby and Kevin, most of these professionals said that at 14, Chad was too young for them to conclusively pathologize. Shari basically describes her parents as being at their wits' end and not knowing what to do to get Chad to fall in line and basically be a little robot like they wanted. Shari goes on to describe how this desperation led them straight into the hands of a monster, armed with a tight smile and a mind full of psychological warfare tactics. A monster who would see my mother's inner darkness and cultivate it, nurture it, until it eclipsed all light. A monster named Jody Hildebrandt. Yes, so enter Jody, and that unfortunately is where we're going to leave off today, because that is all covered in part 3, and we're going to get into that. You guys, I don't even know how Shari is making it. Shari has gone through it, and Chad is going through it too, and I feel bad for both these kids. We're going to see how it all shapes up. I want to know what you guys think. If you've already read further, don't give any spoilers in the comments, but if you have questions or if you have just insight into what they were going through, then leave all of that in the comments below. Again, like I said, the resource is going to be down in the description box, and I look forward to hearing from you guys. Until next week with part 3. Thanks, guys. Now, even though Ruby had a massive following on her 8 channel in our household, on 8 passengers worth and a mind full of psychological warfare attacks,